because if I move, the camera won't register me. I prefer standing up, but... Cierto que ahí se vería cuando estaba grabando, ¿cierto? Pero todavía no. Listo, listo, listo. Did you have time to read the poem? ¿Listo? Okay. Oh, so thank you very much for joining us today for this special meeting with Professor Luisa Matek from the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences of the University of Osijek in Croatia, and Professor Daniel Serravalle de Sá, who is a professor at Universidad Federal de Santa Catarina in Brazil, where I stayed for 4 years. And although she's not here with us, she's one of the authors of the book that I told my students about last week, Giselle Tiba Marín Orgado. She is at the moment professor at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. So the three of them accepted the invitation to stay with us for this maybe 1 hour, 1 and a half, and talk about Coleridge, a special poet from the 18th century, romantic poet that I think is very important for English literature. And I love the different perspectives they have about Coleridge. So I would like to thank Jorge Iván for bringing his students, and I would like to thank his students for being here. My students, they have to be here, but they also want to be here because they wanted to meet you, Daniela and Luisa. So I don't know if you want to say something before we begin.
Well, I would like to thank you for inviting us. This is such an exciting opportunity. I've actually never been to South America, and so now, at least virtually, I'm there, and I'm very happy to spend this time with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Luisa. Daniel?
Thank you as well for putting this event together. I'm very happy to be here, such an international event. So many people from so many different countries. So thank you for this. It's a pleasure to meet my colleague, Professor Lubica, who I didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have just met. And I have known Marta since she worked here for 4 years at the University of Santa Catarina.
Mm-hmm.
And also Professor Gomez. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Yes.
Okay, so I will tell
students who don't like to read, they can see how literature can help bring people together, right?
Yes, yes, that's a beautiful statement. Yes, literature can help bring people from very different countries together. No, I will tell you a very, very, very brief biography of the professors so you know who they are. They are very important people who wanted to share this time with us. So let's take profit of that. Luisa Matek is a PhD associate professor then, and she's a director of a Center for Popular Culture and the English department at Osijek in Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. The name of the university, I'm going to read it complete. We are also Universidad de Antioquia only, but there is J.J. Stross Mayer University of Osijek, Croatia. Okay. She had this recent publication, Gothic Ocean, Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, that we read at least the introduction with the students. And later I want to ask you, Luisa, how did you get in touch with the journal? But I found another article, Luisa, that you published, Teaching Horror Literature in a Multicultural Classroom, that I recommend you. I can send you the link. I think it's a very interesting article. I can also send it to Daniela and Giselle that is listening to us. I'm going to mention, as I said, Giselle Tiba Marin Orgado, who is in YouTube. She is working at the Guimarães Rosa Institute. She's a lecturer there at the University of Birmingham. And she published with Professor Daniel Serra Vale de Sá the book A Balada do Velho Marinero. If you want to have a look, I can. Published by Universidad Federal de Santa Catarina. But Giselle also worked on a very interesting author. I'm very much fond of this author, Murasaki Shikibu. She's an author, a Japanese author of the 11th century who wrote a huge novel, 1,000 pages, that is called Genji Monogatari. I told Giselle that on another occasion, I would like to talk with her about that novel. And she published that in Comparative Literature and Translation Studies, Volume 2, an Indian journal. And then Daniel, I left Daniel for the end. Daniel Serravale de Sá is a senior lecturer at UFSC, Departamento de Língua e Literatura Estrangeiras in Brazil. And he is part of the research group on Gothic studies at Universidad de Santa Catarina in Brazil. We have some students here very much interested in Gothic literature. And he published also a book that I can also send you, which is Multilingual Poe, no? Multilingual Poe, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, translated also into French, German, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. So she's specializing in this sort of multilingual publications that I think are very interesting for us. If I missed something in their biography, I can send you also the links to the curriculum. But if you want to say something else about you, please feel free to do it. So I said when we prepare this meeting, I said maybe we can begin with Luisa and ask her about this article she wrote on Coleridge, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, because she uses the concept of Gothic sea, Gothic tourism. That was what most interested me, no? Tourism, but Gothic, no? So maybe she'll tell us something about that, Luisa.
Okay. Thank you very much for your interest. As an academic, I always wonder if people actually read my papers. And now I know that at least Martha does. So thank you very much. Yes, well, this was my reading. It was specifically done for the purpose of a conference called Waterscapes. It was Portuguese-based, and it was based in Portugal. And the idea of this project, they have a series of conferences and meetings and publications, had to do with water and tourism and ocean in general. And because I do Gothic, I wanted to give them a reading of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner as both a poem about the ocean, obviously, but also a poem about tourism, but a kind of a dark version of tourism. So if you have read the poem, you know that the mariner actually has lots of problems on the ocean, right? He's always in some kind of trouble. And the idea is basically that even his venture from the very beginning had this dark tone, because we know that the Europeans ventured across the ocean for dark reasons, which is why I suggest that much of tourism is actually dark or Gothic in its essence. In particular, the European travelers, but we can safely call them colonizers, went sailing across the seas in order not only to explore the world, but also exploit the world. So the idea of tourism is made dark in this sense, right? So this is why tourism is seen as Gothic in the poem. And then we have this aspect of the ocean. Why the ocean is Gothic? Well, according to theories of Gothic, Gothic spaces are spaces that are dark and scary, but primarily spaces that unsettle whoever finds themselves there. And my thesis was that, of course, a European sailor is destabilized and unsettled on the ocean, right? It's not his place. He's not supposed to be there. So he finds himself in a new environment, which is, on the one hand, unknown, but on the other hand, also scary, right? And this idea of a scary environment was proven to be true by the events that were described in the poem, and because the mariner somehow feels disgust for all the living creatures that he sees during his time at sea. First, of course, the most notorious sense of disgust and hatred that resulted in a murder is his relationship to the bird, the albatross, which was murdered, although it was supposed to bring good luck to the sailors, right? And this random act of violence, as I argue in the paper, proves that the mariner as a subject is destabilized and unsettled and behaves irrationally, right? So throughout the paper, I actually analyze the poem, and I explain how he sees all the creatures as abject, which is a term used by Kristeva for things that we find repulsive. And he finds repulsive anything that has to do with the ocean, with the animals that live in the ocean. And he also dislikes the weather. So ultimately, and maybe to conclude my answer at this point, he not only dislikes the ocean specifically, but nature in general. And for this, he is punished. He sees nature as a place of danger, as a place that should be conquered. And because of this, in many ways, we can also suggest that the Rime of the Ancient Mariner represents a type of proto-eco poem, right? A poem that also deals with how people treat the natural environment and how they view it, because we know that typically we exploit it, we pollute it, we destroy it. And of course, all of these ideas, as I suggest, make the poem Gothic. I hope this answers your question.
Thank you very much. So it's so strange to find a mariner that is aggressive with the birds of the sea that accompany him. Well, you will know in the poem. I don't know if Danielle wants to ask her something. Would you like to ask a question to Luisa, Daniel?
Yes, I do. I read your article and I was very impressed with the Gothic things that you spotted, like the sea creatures and all those events. Even the boat, the ship, the vessel, which kind of reappears in Edgar Allan Poe, Arthur Gordon Pym. There is a ghost ship with a grinning skeleton, and I was, wow, that's indeed very, very Gothic. I never exploited really. I never stopped to think about its Gothic potential. Like yourself, I teach English literature here, and well, we were talking, right? We have to teach many things, from drama to poetry and prose. And this is one poem that I teach, but I usually look at it from the perspective of Romanticism.
Yeah.
But never the Gothic. So I was pleasantly surprised when I read, so, wow, so much Gothic potential here. So thank you for the article. I'll teach the poem differently now.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for your comments.
Yeah, I was also very, very happy to find this article, Luisa. And I would like to ask you, how did you find this journal? Because she published this article that I can also send you. I can send all this information to Jorge Iván. And she published it in a journal from Universidade do Algarve in Portugal, in Faro. And it's a journal dedicated to literature and tourism, which I found very, very interesting, because I'm always looking for issues for literature, no? Issues that help us survive. And so I found that a good idea for a journal. And exactly when I wanted to do this meeting with Daniel, we had talked about it in January, I think, that we saw with Daniel and his wife in Brazil. I said, we're going to do this meeting when I found your article, Luisa. So I said, it's wonderful. We have to do something together. So I'm going to ask you, how did you find this journal?
Yes, the journal is actually established by the organizers of the conference, which I mentioned, because I first presented this paper at this particular conference. And the organizers from the University of Algarve in Portugal have a project that deals with literature and tourism, and they're interested in exploiting the relationship between the two. And in this article, I also argue that the two have been connected ever since the Europeans started traveling, because the second they started traveling, they also started writing about traveling, right? So it's kind of connected, and we have these travel logs that are very, very old. If we look at English literature in particular, I have to mention the Canterbury Tales, which are basically stories from pilgrims traveling, right? And that's a medieval text, right? So they have started this journal, and if you're interested in the topic, I'm sure they'll be happy to publish something.
Yeah, it would be interesting, a course on that, no? On literature and travel, no? Very interesting. Thank you very much, Luisa. So I would like to ask Danielle and Giselle, why did you choose? Because I know you have already started this. It's a kind of project, no, of publishing in a multilingual way, a poem especially. Why did you choose Coleridge for this particular product of Multilingual Edition?
Yes, we, like I was saying, we have to teach many different courses. I'm in the foreign language department, and we have 5 languages here. So back in 2015, I was teaching one of those big multi-student classes with students from Italian and Spanish and German and English. We teach them in Portuguese. It's kind of this basic course that all of them have to go through. And I wanted to give them something from each and every language, but I don't speak all these languages. Then I knew back then that The Raven had been translated by the Portuguese Fernando Pessoa and also by the Brazilian Machado de Assis. I also knew about Baudelaire and his translation of Paul into the French language. Then I decided to look up if I could find The Raven in Italian, and I did find it, and then in German, and then I did find it. So I brought all these poems, all these translations. I don't really work with translations, to the class, and I asked them to comment, right, and to compare the Portuguese version and with the English version, each in their language pair, right? English or Portuguese, or German and Portuguese. Right? Then at the end of the semester, I kind of collected all this and published O Corvo, The Raven, Multilingual. And then the Rime of the Ancient Mariner came around in 2018, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Giselle was in the class. You see, Giselle, she was already a PhD when she decided to take an English course again, to start an undergrad course in English. So for me, it was a privilege to have her in class, a colleague, a doctor in my class. And we were talking. I was teaching at the time English poetry, and the idea came about. Why don't we do the same? Why don't we organize the Rime of the Ancient Mariner multilingual? And that's how it came about. And it was a little bit harder to find the translations. But we did find in all 5 languages, and we managed to get, as far as we know, the first ones. You see, everything was done on the internet, so we had to count on whatever was available on the internet. Sometimes a Canadian library that digitalized an old book. So we took that source, and that's how it came about. Lots of hours researching the internet for the Rime of the Ancient Mariner in all these different languages.
Yeah, I can imagine that it was a difficult work because it's a less known poem, I would say, no? On the contrary, The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe, well, everybody has translated The Raven, no? Every great, well, I was surprised I learned in your book that it was translated by Pessoa and by Machado de Assis, no? By Pessoa in Portugal and by Machado de Assis in Brazil. So it was very interesting. Gisela, do you have something to comment on what Daniel just told us?
I was wondering about whether all the translations were done by people who are poets. Are all of them poets or translators?
That's a great question. I don't really know. We didn't really go into the biographies.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. Because, yeah, we have a translation in Croatian. It's contained in this book. I mean, it doesn't mean anything to you, but I happen to have it. But it was translated by a Croatian poet, Luko Poljetak. He is a famous contemporary a Croatian poet and translator. So, and there is always an issue translating from English to Croatian, because generally speaking, Croatian words are longer than English words. So meter gets messed up if you translate poetry, right? So usually most English poetry isn't translated into Croatian that frequently, but when it is, usually it's done by poets, right? And now I heard that Pessoa was one of the translators. Of course, he's a poet, he's a writer, which wasn't surprising, but I was just wondering whether all of these translators were also maybe poets.
Machado de Assis was a poet, at least at the beginning.
Okay.
He was, at the time, he was more linked to Romanticism.
Mm-hmm.
But then we know him today and as a realist writer. There is this big shift in his ideas and his career and even writing style. So he leaves the romantic type of writing in the past and he starts something new. He's one of our greatest, perhaps, I think it's fair to say that he's the greatest Brazilian writer in the 19th century. And yes, he was a poet, but then he left it for prose.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure about the others.
Yeah.
About Freiligrath, which is the German, and Aldo, the Italian. I'm not really sure if they're poets. That's a great question.
Okay, Daniel. Yeah, Luisa, excuse me.
Go
on. Daniel, but because you give an introduction in the book, no, and you talk a little bit about the translations, can you tell us something about it? Because we discussed something about the titles with the students. I'm going to ask one of them if he wants to comment, but we would like to hear you before they comment on the translations.
I'm sorry. Can you see me?
Yes,
okay.
We can see you.
All
yes.
Right, all right. I thought I had muted. All right. I took some notes, right? And I don't really remember everything, as I wasn't really. You see, Marta, this was meant to be an educational resource, right? This is meant for students. I did write an introduction, and in which I explain a few things, but I'm not really a specialist in translation. So I think from my notes here, I remember that the German, let's start with the German. Okay, Ferdinand Freiligrath. So he translated it in 1831. It's part of a collection. I'm not going to read the name. I don't think I can pronounce it. And yeah, also the title. All right, so he published it in 1877, but we actually used the edition from 1924. So a later edition published 50 years afterwards. And he follows the same format as Coleridge. I don't speak German. I had the help of my colleague, Werner Heidemann from the department. And he helped us out, Gisele and I, to correct the spellings and punctuation, right? So he helped us. And right, so moving to the French now, it's Auguste Barbier. His translation was also carried out in 1877, right? And I couldn't find information if he's a poet, but I think he chooses prose, unlike the German version, in which he uses rhymes and meters. And I think the French version, it's in prose. Italian now, it's Enrico Mencioni. Actually, we found quite a few translations to Italian, and I think we chose the first one, the oldest one we could find. They all have different titles. Yes, and also in Spanish, we found quite a few translations. Yes, with La Rima del Viejo Navegante, Balada del Viejo Marinero, La Canción del Viejo Marinero. So all different titles and different approaches to translation. And well, in Portuguese, there are the translations I already mentioned by Fernando Pessoa and Machado de Assis. And there's a more recent one by a scholar called Alípio Correia de Franca Neto. He did it in 2005, I think, as part of his PhD. So yes, from Machado de Assis to Alípio, we found different translations into Portuguese, but none as old as the German ones and the French ones.
Thank you very much. Sure, Jorge Iván wants to.
Yes, I have a question. Well, besides the title, have you found also differences in the content of the poem?
Yes, depends on the languages I can read, right? Yeah, sometimes the writers, in order to keep the metric or to keep the rhyme, they had to change the original words in English into something more more feasible, let's say that, in their languages. So yes, they sometimes they do change words for the sake of the meter or the metric, actually, or for the sake of the rhyme. It's, I think, you surely know more than me about this. It's the idea of domestication and estrangeirização and domesticação. Do you bring it closer to your culture? Do you leave the words as they are in the original language? And then the reader has to deal with that strangeness in the texts. And also a matter of metric and rhyme. Do you keep the alliterations? What do you do? Yes, there are many differences, right? From one text to the other, one translation to the other, different approaches.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. If in prose we see differences in translations, in poems much more, no? Because I think the translator of the poem, even if he's not a poet, I would say Luisa, he approaches the poem in a very subjective way, no? Mm-hmm. And that's why I think we analyze a little bit about the titles. I think Eduardo, if you allow us, would like to tell us something about the titles?
Hi. We were discussing the titles in class, and we found very interesting things. It shows how these different approaches also affect the titles of the translations. And we found, for example, that in the Italian version, the title is La Leyenda del Vecchio Marinaio. Leyenda made us think about something like more epic, not so Gothic or not so musical as the other versions, which are like baladas in Spanish or la chanson en français, or a balada also in Portuguese. We found interesting also that the German version, which is part of your book, it's only der alte Matrose, that is just like the Ancient Mariner. It takes away like the part of the musicality of the title. So yeah, we found that pretty interesting.
Thank you very much, Eduardo. Yeah, and in Croatian, can you pronounce the poem, Lubizia?
Yeah,
Even just to hear the sound.
It was translated as Pjesma o starom mornaru, which is literally a song about the ancient mariner. That's how it was translated, but like a song, right? So that's
Okay.
interesting. The comment about musicality was very interesting. But I also find it interesting the comment about it being translated as the legend, because one of the readings, I think one of the dominant readings of the poem is also a Christian reading of the poem, because clearly the mariner was punished for his sin, and he tried to confess a part of it, and he succeeded, but ultimately he was punished. So this idea of a legend can be partially connected also with the idea of sainthood. But he didn't become a saint in the end. He was cursed, right? So it's a kind of the opposite. So yeah, that's very interesting. What I also wanted to ask your students, maybe their impressions, and I don't know which languages they speak, but what usually happens in Croatian translations of, let's say, romantic poems or any other poem is that translators tend to use archaic, old Croatian words to translate poetry. Does this happen in Portuguese, in Spanish, or in other languages as well? Whoever wants to answer.
Daniel? Thank you. Daniel is a poet, you know?
Oh, okay.
Daniel is going to comment. He's a
Okay.
poet.
Hi, my name is Daniel, and I actually had a similar question to that because, well, first I would like to say other thing is that you were saying before that
Daniel, ¿quieres sentarte aquí
Okay,
para que quedes en la cámara?
you were wondering if all the translators were poets, and I actually was looking to the Spanish translator of the poem. And it's interesting because it brings us back to the musicality of it, because he's an author on opera books and ballads. So he's not exactly a poet, but he goes to the musicality of the poem, and I think you can see that in the translation. And the other thing that I wanted to ask that is related to what you were saying is because we realize that, for example, all the translations don't have the author's comment like on the side, right? So we figured that it could be because of the time difference, but based on that, I know it because of the choices that Coleridge does in his words in English. I was wondering how that time difference actually affected the poem, because the original poem and the translation that are on the book, it took a time to translate Coleridge. So how that time affected the translations?
Right.
I don't know. Daniel, is not to ask about the translation work exactly, but no, Daniel, as I understand. But remember, in the original Coleridge's poem, there are some notes on the margin that explain. It's a kind of explanation. I don't know. And our question here was why this wasn't translated in the other versions.
I don't really know. It only came about in the 1824 edition, right? I think it's something, or maybe the 1832 edition. I don't quite remember now. But to start with, when the poem was published in the Lyrical Ballads, which is the book that kind of, it's considered the beginning of English Romanticism, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they published this book. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is the first poem. But like Lubitsa was saying about the archaic language, the poem was considered too extraordinary because of the story it tells, right? But also impenetrable because of its archaic language. And ironically, this is one of the things that we praise the most nowadays, this innovation regarding language, which, remember that at the time, before Romanticism came about, neoclassicism was the big thing. People were writing a neoclassical way, right? Different people were writing different things, but neoclassicism was the trend. Then Coleridge comes to innovate with this archaic language. He was looking at the past, at medieval times, and he names it, you were saying about the names, La Legenda or the ballad. You see, the ballad is a song. It's like a medieval song, and it rhymes because it helps you to remember, right? When things rhyme, you're telling a story that rhymes, it helps you to remember. That's the basis of a ballad, right? It's linked to oral tradition. So Coleridge, he's drawing on medieval sources, medieval language, medieval ideas to write his poem. But as I was saying, it was too much for the people at the time. So he decided to write those glosses or those paratexts on the margin, these side comments. Gisele would talk about this a lot better than me because she did her PhD on paratexts. And it's incredible, right? Because it creates different levels of interpretation. There are many narrators. There's the mariner, there is the narrator, there's the young man, and there is the sidelines, right? The margins. And so it's a language game. It's wonderful. That's one thing I love about this poem, and how many layers you can read. Now, I don't really know why these side comments, these glosses, they were lost, because they're so important, right? They're so important. Maybe in the most recent translations, people didn't adapt the archaic language. They didn't mind that Coleridge was writing in this old language, archaic-like, pseudo-archaic, if you want. And then they just wrote the poem or translated the poem in a modern language and decided to get rid of the glosses. But I don't really know for sure. I'm just speculating here, right? But it's important information, and it shouldn't really have been excluded from the translation, right? I see you have a theory, right, Danielle? You have a theory, and it seems to me that your theory is the closer we get to our time, the side comments, they get lost.
Yeah, because as you said, in the English and the Coleridge version, the original one, he uses a lot of archaic English, right? But in Spanish, for example, it's not as archaic. So that's maybe why we thought of that. And obviously, the Spanish version is much recent. So we thought maybe that was the decision of the translator to not do it, because he didn't find it, I don't know, necessary, because it wasn't archaic in the translation. So maybe that.
I see. Let me ask you something. Do you think Spanish language has changed a lot from 200 years in the past from now? Can you read a Spanish text written in the 1800s?
I think that what changes the most about Spanish is the structure. maybe a structure in Spanish 200 years ago wasn't the same, so it would be difficult for me to read it because of that. But I don't know about the words, maybe not that part, but a structure is pretty different.
I see. I see.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, for your comments. I don't know if any other student would like to comment on something. Any of your students, Jorge Ivan? No?
Can I ask
Yes, sure,
Lubica,
Daniel.
about, has Croatian changed a lot?
Yeah,
Through-
I was thinking about that as Daniel was talking about Spanish. Actually, it seems to me that in Croatian it's the opposite. I think our syntax hasn't changed much, but the lexis, the vocabulary has significantly. Yeah, yeah, it's different. It's the opposite actually. Yeah, and when the poets use the archaic words, when they translate poetry, it only makes the reading for students that much more difficult because they don't know these words, right? The syntax hasn't changed, but the lexis has significantly, yeah. That's exactly what I asked about, whether your translations in various respective languages, whether they use these archaic terms, because our tend to really like to use them, but then it makes the text impenetrable for the contemporary reader, right? Croatian reader.
Yeah. We haven't analyzed all the translations, but in general, I think we can say that in Spanish, I think our translators tend to modernize the language. And I think is that for the general public, so the reading is easier. I would say in general, maybe in the 19th century, translators were different. They could use the language of the classics, no? But today, I think we modernize. And if I might say something, when Daniela started talking, precisely, I read a comment from Giselle from YouTube, and Giselle was saying that exactly, she said, let's talk about the parallel text, paratextual elements in the poem that were not taken into account by the translators, So Giselle, if you're listening to us, we took into account your comment. And when in the class, when we saw the poem, immediately we said, my goodness, this is so good, the comments on the margin, because they help us understand the poem. Our first question was why it wasn't translated, And I asked Lubija, in Croatian, it was translated?
Yes.
The text in the margins?
Yes. I don't know if you can see it. If I turn the book,
yes.
you see these, on the margins, we have the comment. Yeah. Yes, it was.
That was very good, no?
But the Croatian translation is relatively recent. It's from 1996. So it's, I don't know, 30 years old, something like that.
Yeah. I know, Lubija, maybe a last question, or you want to ask something?
More than a question, is a comment. Is related to the poem, because I mean, translated the way that it is today, I would say that is a matter of functionalism, taking into account who is the poem going to, but also the poem has lost a lot about his spirit as well, So it's important as well to ask ourselves, to reflect, we as translators, how to keep the spirit of the language, taking into account that it has a lot to say in that way, and the functionalism in this case, taking into account that people wouldn't understand the archaic language as well. So this is quite important to reflect about it, and to see how to keep that balance between both translations or versions as well.
I agree. That's very important. On the one hand, it's not like it's a recipe for a cake and you translate it so that a person can bake the cake, but the poem is actually a work of art, and you intervene in something that was constructed very specifically to be as it is, right? And then as a translator, you also have to be a little bit of an artist and creative, right? I think when we talk about poetry, obviously, but in other cases as well. Yeah.
Okay, Lubija, and I wanted to ask you something which can be a little bit political. I think you know a lot about Colombia. We are badly famed. But from Croatia, I remember an author called Ivo Andrić or Ivo Andrić.
Yeah. Yes,
Andrić, and he wrote in Serbo-Croatian. So was this a language? I read it in French, and I said translated. It said in the book translated from the Serbo-Croat. So I said, is that a language that exists? That with the separation of the two, Serbia and Croatia, this language is not functional anymore?
It no longer exists, but actually it is kind of controversial. Both. So Ivo Andrić also lived, and he was born in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So actually 3 countries are involved: Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia. And, you know, everybody says Ivo Andrić was their writer, right? And of course, he's also the only one from this particular region or from former Yugoslavia who won the Nobel Prize. So he is a kind of a big deal, right? Yeah, but this language no longer exists. It was, everybody agrees that it was a kind of a artificial construct, a kind of a blend between Croatian and Serbian, understandable to everybody in the former Yugoslavia. But now, obviously, each of the languages has its own distinct grammar, vocabulary. We can still understand each other very well, but politically, people tend to emphasize the difference between languages, right?
Okay, thank you very much. Do you have any more comments, Danielle? Lubija, do you have any comments?
I like to go back a little bit and talk about those Catholic or Christian, perhaps, symbolism, like from the medieval past, the albatross that hangs. I'm sorry about the cat again.
Very Gothic.
Yes, it's raining a lot here, so water everywhere. Coleridge would say it's raining a lot, and so she I think she wants to go out, and she can't. So she's
trapped, just like the mariner.
She's stressed and needy here. Well, she's gone now. So this Christian symbology, right? The albatross, also the whole the trip that he takes. It's kind of what do they call it? The rise and the fall, right? The Christian rise and fall, penitence, and then he has to tell his story. So that's one way of reading it. Yes, that's one a very popular way of reading it. Yes. So that's why I think UdeA reading is so interesting and so innovative. Another way of reading it's through by means of the romantic elements and talk about nature, and also you can talk about the those great travels, the big international transatlantic travels that the Portuguese and the Spanish started, right? Especially there in Sagres and the Algarve, the south of Portugal. That's where Vasco da Gama and many other Bartolomeu Dias and many travelers left from Europe towards India and Africa and the Caribbean and Brazil. So
Yeah.
I think was already kind of a pastiche in the 18th century, right? Because the world was industrial revolution was there. So
Yeah.
these stories about pirates and piracy and these tales, perhaps from the medieval time, echoing medieval legends, which is another way of reading Coleridge. There's so many layers.
Yes.
So I was talking about symbolism and symbology, Christian symbology, and also a theme, themes, and there is also the language level. And we were talking about the language games.
Yeah.
It is a great poem. It's a great poem, and as Lubitsa has shown us, it still has much to give. She brings a new angle to it, a new way
Thank
of
you.
reading it.
But also, I think the translators as well. I can't remember now, but somebody has mentioned that there has been a new translation of the poem in the 21st century, 2000 and something, right? So it proves that the readers are still interested in this poem that was written late in the 18th century, right? So it's a very old poem, but it's really, really rich in meaning or multi-layered. And I think it can speak to any type of reader, whether you're a religious person, whether you're a person who likes nature, who's interested in eco-activism, or whatever, if you simply like ballads about heroes and heroic quests and things like that. So that's why it's a very, very precious text, I would say.
Jorge is going to say
Well,
something.
here in Colombia, we have every year a poetry festival, which is quite important, and it is people that come from all over the world, and it has become a city event. So it would be really interesting as well. Someday you are kindly invited if you would like to go and share with us this great event in our city.
Oh, thanks.
Thank you, Rivan.
Yeah.
In Medellin, there is a poetry
Yes, Medellin.
international festival that has
No.
been going on for 30 years, something like that. And it's still, it's in August, July and August, if you remember the dates. And the city is full of people from all over the world. And they come and they read their poems in their language and their translations. It is very moving. But now that Lubiza, I think one day you will come to Medellin. I said the same to Daniel, but one day you will go to Florianopolis, and Daniel, you must know that since I came from Florianopolis in 2018, I think everybody who approaches me knows about Florianopolis because it's the first thing I say. I lived in Florianopolis. It's a beautiful island. It's the most beautiful place in the world. But what is very interesting is that in your introduction, you mentioned an influence that Coleridge had to write his poem of a sailor who went sailing to the South Atlantic. I think Coleridge was going that way. And this sailor, I don't know if it was my delirium for Florianopolis, but I think that I read, Daniel, that this sailor stopped in Florianopolis, no?
So apparently, when I was researching how, can you hear me? It just froze for a minute. Oh, okay, great. So as I was researching, I came across the information about this sailor called, I think it's Simon Hartley, and he lived 70 years before Coleridge. And apparently he's the inspiration for stories such as Robinson Crusoe and also the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. When he came back, he had these incredible stories about shipwrecks and about distant foreign lands with different fruits and different animals. So apparently this man was the inspiration for Coleridge. And his ship called, oh, I forget now, because it's such a detail, right? I forget his ship now. It left from Portsmouth, England, and it landed in Florianopolis, which is an island. It landed here for, I think, for water and food, perhaps. You see, the capital of Brazil at the time was Rio de Janeiro, which is quite far. And Santa Catarina was like this outpost to protect the Portuguese land from the Spanish and also from the French and from the English. And I think the English were friends at some point. But Santa Catarina is like the island of Santa Catarina, which we call Florianopolis nowadays, was this outpost. And Simon Hartley, he did land here, which, like, it's just a coincidence, really. Nothing literary about this, but it's just a coincidence.
There is some literary effects on Florianopolis because Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who wrote Le Petit Prince, also landed in Florianopolis, no? Before he went to Buenos Aires. No?
Yes.
There is even a street called Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. No? Well, I think we've taken enough of your time, and I think students want to have lunch also. And so I really want to thank you both for this, for sharing this time with us, and I want to thank the students for coming here. I want to remind you that I didn't do it at the beginning of the presentation. This is one of the activities that we are developing at the School of Languages within the frame of the UNESCO Chair of Linguistic Policies for Multilingualism. We've been doing that since last year, and the main quarters of this chair is precisely at UFSC, Universidade Federal de Santa Catarina in Florianopolis, where Daniel is a professor. So you will watch because we'll have information of continuous activities of this kind of multilingual activities, no? So really, I thank you very much for making part of our program, enriching our knowledge, no? If you want to say something, Jorge Iván.
Just thank you all for your time, and this was a very nice experience to us as well, to learn a little bit more about poetry, which is quite difficult for us, for our students, and also for us as translators, that we are just beginning in this world of translation as well. The case of my students, that they are just beginning, and it would be very interesting as well. Thank you very much.
Very nice seeing you both there.
Thank you for inviting us. It was very nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucia. And thank you to Giselle that is there. I know she's there.
Okay.
Daniel?
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting us. I love to meet you, Lubitsa, and Professor Gomez as well. It was lovely to meet you. I'd like to keep in touch.
Yes.
Of
yes,
course.
let's
It was
keep in
lovely
touch.
to see you, Martha.
Yes,
well.
very, very nice seeing you and your cats. And Lubitsa, nice meeting you. Yes, and I hope one day we'll meet, I don't know if in Algarve, in Florianopolis, in Medellin, but it's important
Somewhere.
to meet us personally.
Yes.
Thank you very much to the students because they were very interested in your work.
And that's
Thank
the
you
most
very much.
important. If it was interesting for them, then this is the most important part.
So
Thanks,
thank you,
everyone.
Giselle, too.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.